I knew things were going to be different as soon as I started my new school. I was born and raised in Philly, and moving an hour away from the city was going to take some adjustment. That adjustment meant I had to learn to live with it. I kept my nose clean and stayed out of trouble, as my father requested and my mother insisted. The population in the new area was diverse. To say the least, some black people, some Hispanic folks, a few Italians, and some Jewish families. The majority, though, were hard-headed Dutchies, not Amish or Mennonites, just German Lutherans who dominated the area and everything in it. It was a melting pot. So I had no real trouble blending in, but I missed my Philly friends deeply. After graduation, I stayed in the area mainly to be close to my family. I made regular trips to my old neighborhood and stayed close to my childhood friends. My first job was driving a fuel oil delivery truck, and within a few years, I moved inside to handle dispatching and taking orders. I had a knack for the business, and even envisioned myself owning a similar operation in the future. Socially, I had no trouble making friends with the opposite gender, and my personal life was better than I expected. When I got married, my mother was slightly disappointed that my wife, Marcy, wasn't Italian, but she tried her best to accept Marcy without reservations. After 2 kids, Marcy insisted I get a vasectomy. I had no issue with that, but once the kids started school, Marcy wanted to go back to work. My father never liked the idea of a wife and mother working, and looking back, his reasoning made sense in a way. It wasn't that I minded Marcy working. I disliked that she was reconnecting with people she knew and grew up with. I liked some of her friends, but not all of them. In school, Marcy had been very involved in student activities, which she loved. I avoided those things and the people involved in them, as I found them snobby. We never really talked about our past relationships or what we had done before we met. It wasn't a rule, just something we naturally avoided. We had been married for about 10 years when things started falling apart. Marcy worked in the claims department of a national insurance company. I became concerned when she started working overtime and weekends. 6 months later, it became clear to me that I needed to confront the situation. When she told me about a work seminar coming up, I couldn't believe she had the nerve to ask me about it. "It's only for 3 days, Tony," she said. "I've already talked to your mom, and she agreed to stay with the kids while I'm gone. You'll be home in the evenings. You can handle cooking for yourself." "Who's going on the seminar?" I asked, trying to hide my suspicion. She perked up a little as she answered. 6 girls from the department, Betty Klink from personnel, and Rodney. I smiled when she said Rodney's name. I was amazed she hadn't figured out that I already knew about her secret lunches and late-night work sessions with her boss. Rodney and Marcy grew up together, and he was one of those kids who joined every club and activity, except sports, back in school. "Do you think I'm a fool?" I asked her. "Tony, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" she replied. "I've known about you and Rodney for 6 months now," I said. "If you think I'm letting you go away with him for 3 days, you're out of your mind. Rodney is my boss, Tony. There's nothing going on between us. I'd never cheat on you, you know that." I crushed the empty beer can in my hand and walked to the kitchen to grab another one. Sitting back down, I took a deep breath and said, "You're the mother of my children, and you do a good job at that. The only reason I haven't thrown you out is because of them. My mom told me to stay firm and hope you'd get this out of your system for the sake of the kids. If I divorce you, the courts will give you custody, and I can't let that happen." Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You told your mom I was cheating on you?" "No," I replied. "A lady from church told her. I just didn't deny it when she asked me." "You can't be serious," she said, trembling. "Rodney lives at 321 David Drive, 3 blocks from your office," I continued. "You and your boss go there 3 times a week and stay for 3 hours each time. What are you doing there? And what about all the overtime you've been putting in? Did you know the cleaning lady at your office also goes to church with my mom?" She was shaking, her lip trembling. "I hate you, Tony," she screamed, storming out of the room. From that day on, our marriage changed. I slept in the spare room. We had been saving $60,000 for a down payment on our dream house, but my dream had turned into a nightmare. Though things seemed to normalize over time, the atmosphere at home was cold. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go to her company Christmas party, mainly to keep an eye on her. At the party, I noticed Marcy exchanging glances with Rodney. When she excused herself to use the restroom, Rodney disappeared too. My suspicions were confirmed. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I knew life would change as soon as I started at my new school. Born and raised in Philly, moving an hour away from the city was bound to be an adjustment. I had to learn to deal with the changes and, at the request of my father and insistence of my mother, keep my nose clean and stay out of trouble. The community was diverse. Some black, some Hispanic, a few Italians, and some Jews. The majority were hard-headed Dutchies, not Amish or Mennonites, but German Lutherans who dominated the area. It was a melting pot, so blending in wasn't too hard, though I missed my Philly friends. After graduation, I stayed in the area to be close to my family, but kept in touch with old friends and made regular trips back to the old neighborhood. My first job was driving a fuel oil delivery truck. Within a few years, I moved into dispatching and taking orders. I had a knack for the business and could picture myself owning a similar operation one day. Socializing wasn't a problem. My life exceeded expectations, especially when I got married. My mother, however, was a bit disappointed that Marcy, my new wife, wasn't Italian. Still, she made an effort to welcome her wholeheartedly. After 2 kids, Marcy insisted I get a vasectomy, which I didn't mind. But once the kids started school, Marcy decided she wanted to work. My father had always believed that wives and mothers shouldn't work. I didn't completely agree, but I saw his point. It wasn't Marcy working that bothered me. It was a socializer with people from her past. She had been heavily involved in school activities, while I'd avoided them, finding the participants egotistical and cliquish. I knew she'd been sexually active before we met. So had I, but we never discussed our pasts. It wasn't a rule, just an unspoken understanding. After about 10 years of marriage, cracks began to show. Marcy had taken a job in the claims department of a national insurance company. Her increasing overtime and weekend work raised red flags. 6 months later, the situation came to a head. When Marcy brought up attending a 3-day seminar, I couldn't believe her audacity. "Tony, it's just 3 days. I already asked your mom to watch the kids, and I know you can handle dinners. What's the problem? Who's going to the seminars?" I asked, masking my suspicions. She brightened, unaware of what I already knew. 6 women from the department, Betty Kling from personnel, and Rodney. Her voice changed slightly at his name. She didn't realize I knew about her special lunches and overtime with Rodney, her boss. I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Rodney? That's interesting." Marcy looked confused. "What are you talking about? I've known about you and Rodney for 6 months. You're not going to any seminar with him. End of story." Her denial was immediate and insistent. "Tony, there's nothing between me and Rodney. He's just my boss." I walked to the kitchen, crushing an empty Budweiser can in my hand, grabbed a fresh one, and returned to my seat. "You're the mother of my kids," I began, "and a good one. That's the only reason I haven't thrown you out. I spoke to my mom, and she told me to stay firm, for the boys' sake. If I leave, the courts will give you custody, and I won't let that happen." Her face fell. "You told your mother I was cheating." "No, someone from her church did, and I didn't deny it." Her disbelief was palpable. "You're serious? I can't believe this." I took a swig of beer. "Rodney lives at 321 David Drive, 3 blocks from your office. You go there 3 times a week and stay for hours. Explain that. Then explain the overtime at the office." Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice trembled. As long as you don't publicly embarrass me or my family, I'll keep things as they are. If that changes, all bets are off." She jumped to her feet, shouting, "Damn you, Tony. I hate you," before storming out. From that day on, I moved into the spare room. Though we still shared the house, our relationship was frozen. The $60,000 we'd saved for a dream home now seemed like money for a life that no longer existed. Marcy stopped working overtime and brought lunch to work, but the damage was done. Against my better judgment, I accompanied her to her company Christmas party. I hoped to pass the evening quietly, but it quickly became clear that wasn't going to happen. As I nursed a beer, I noticed Marcy and Rodney exchanging glances. She excused herself to use the restroom, and Rodney disappeared soon after. Suspicion flared, and I followed. In the men's room, I found them locked in an embrace, his hand under her skirt. Rage took over. I grabbed Rodney by the neck and slammed his head into the tiled wall. Blood poured from his nose, and he crumpled, dragging him by his tie. I hauled him to the middle of the party and let him drop to the floor. "I'm sorry for ruining your party," I said to the stunned crowd. "I'm leaving now, but I'll leave my wife here for your entertainment. Drop her off at the house when you're done." With one last kick to Rodney, I walked out. I called my mom to pick up the boys and packed a bag. Marcy was already home when I returned. She looked upset but didn't say much. "You broke the only rule," I told her. "Don't humiliate me in public." You couldn't resist. Without waiting for her reply, I walked out. She was hanging the horns on me for everyone to see. His cronies were standing by the bar, grinning like they were in on the joke. As Marcy entered the hallway leading to the restrooms, she glanced back to ensure I was still in my seat, then disappeared. On my way to the restrooms, I stopped by the head table and leaned over to apologize for disrupting the party, ensuring I had everyone's attention. Across the room, the grinning crew's smiles faded, replaced by anxious looks. They didn't know how to help their buddy Rodney. The women's restroom was empty, but I found better luck in the men's room. Things escalated quickly from there. They were kissing, his back to me, his hand up her skirt, and there was no resistance on her part. I grabbed Rodney by the neck and slammed his head into the bathroom tile. Something cracked. Marcy started shouting my name, but I ignored her. Blood streamed from Rodney's nose as I spun him around, splattering my shirt. He was limp but still standing, so I punched him in the stomach. He dropped to his knees, vomiting. Marcy tugged on my jacket sleeve, but I shrugged her off. The main hall fell silent as I dragged Rodney out by his tie, ignoring whether I was choking him. The band had stopped playing, and everyone watched as I dumped him in the middle of the floor. "I'm sorry for ruining your party," I announced. "I'll be leaving now, but I'm leaving my wife here for your entertainment. Drop her off at the house when you're done with her." Rodney, on all fours, was a bloody mess. Marcy stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth agape. I couldn't tell if she was upset about her lover's beating or my words to her co-workers. Either way, I didn't care. I noticed Rodney was directly under the mistletoe, so I gave him one last kick between the legs. He crumpled to the floor, bashing his face again for good measure. No one said a word. I called my mom from the car, asking her to pick up the boys because I needed a few days out of town. I didn't trust Marcy to care for them in her current state. My boss granted me a week off, and when I got home, my parents were already there. After paying the babysitter, I packed light, just essentials. Before leaving, I retrieved $62,000 in cash from the rafters in the basement. Stupid? Maybe. But I'd inherited the habit from my mom, who used to stash cash all over her kitchen. As I turned out the lights, a cab pulled up and Marcy stepped out. She sat on the couch, looking more worried than angry. "I told you there was only one rule," I said coldly. "Don't humiliate me or my family in public." "You couldn't resist, could you?" She started crying, but I walked out the door, leaving her to think about it. It wasn't even 9 p.m. I drove toward Atlantic City, but stopped first to see my old friend S. He ran a sandwich shop in the old neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a convenience for locals. But his real income came from less savory endeavors. When I explained my situation, he offered help. "Tony, it'll cost you 20. Can you handle that?" I handed over $20,000. "No problem." S grinned. "You'll need to disappear for a few days. How about Atlantic City? I've got comps for 6 days at the edge." That sounded perfect. S even arranged for Carla, his niece, to accompany me as a cover. I remembered her as a chubby kid, but when she walked in, she was stunning. Slim, confident, with those dark eyes I couldn't forget. I appreciated her effort to keep things civil, but then again, what could she really say? The farce continued for years. My explanation here doesn't fully convey how complicated it all was. Constant disagreements and challenges, but somehow we made it work. At first, things with Carla were great. Over time, though, she began spending more time with her family in Philly and less with me. I didn't blame her. In fact, I felt indebted to her for all she did to help make the breakup easier. But I was stuck. I couldn't divorce Marcy, and as long as the boys were at home, I couldn't throw her out either. These were limits I imposed on myself, but I stuck to them. I hated the situation, but couldn't see a better option. Things came to a head when Terry was 16. A new kid at school, related to Marcy's former lover, started taunting Terry about what had happened years ago. Terry wasn't prepared for it. The fight landed the other boy in the hospital, and Terry was expelled for 2 weeks, facing possible assault charges. Unfortunately, Rick was caught up in the brawl, trying to help his brother. He ended up losing 2 teeth but gained Terry's admiration for his efforts. When I brought the boys home, Marcy met us at the door. Terry immediately tore into her, furious that she'd never told them the truth about what had happened. Marcy didn't defend herself. She just listened as her son vented his anger. I left them to it while I took Rick to the dentist. Rick didn't seem too upset about his teeth, but I was less thrilled about the looming dental bills. When we returned home, Marcy was gone. Her car was still there, but she wasn't. Terry said she grabbed her purse and left without a word. I took a week off work to stabilize things, but Marcy's family refused to talk to me, and after a week, I still had no idea where she was or what she intended to do. Carla and I moved into the house. At first, it was awkward sharing a bed with her under the same roof as the boys, but they adjusted far better than I expected. One day, while I was at work, Carla removed everything in the house that had been Marcy's or reminded us of her. I never asked what she did with it. Carla took over the household duties, and I got her some credit cards to make things easier. Oddly enough, I trusted my mistress more than I ever trusted my wife. Family gatherings were less stressful now. Carla was happier, and my mother was overjoyed. Terry and Rick settled back into their routines, and Rodney's nephew never came back to school. Things seemed to improve, but I was still technically married. 2 months later, I reported Marcy as a runaway spouse. This helped when I filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. A year had to pass before the divorce could be finalized, so I was preparing for the long haul. During this time, the house felt more like a real home than it had in years. Terry and Rick got along well with Carla, though they always called her by her name and never Mom. When my divorce was finalized, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. 2 weeks later, Carla and I drove down to Elton and got married. We were a family again. Terry graduated high school and joined the Air Force. A year later, Rick decided to attend meat cutting school in Toledo. Life moved quickly. Before I knew it, Carla and I were empty nesters. We never heard from Marcy again. My parents moved to Ocala, and we all promised to visit them at least twice a year. With no ties left to reading, Carla and I moved back to Philly. Rick got a job at a fancy butcher shop in Westchester. He visited us a few times a month, always bringing something special from work. About a year later, one of Carla's nieces was getting married, and of course we attended. Italian weddings in Philly are a big deal, Lots of people, plenty of food, and free-flowing booze. We were sitting with friends, enjoying the evening, when I noticed Carla seemed uneasy. She kept glancing across the dance floor. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Carla excused herself to go to the ladies' room, but something felt off. Instead of heading to the restroom, she approached one of her old girlfriends. After some animated conversation, Carla gestured toward a table across the room. Seated there were 3 men and 3 women, the men looking like wannabe tough guys and the women overly dressed and somewhat trashy. Carla returned to our table with a confident but serious expression. "Tony, we have a problem," she said. "Care to explain?" I asked. "One of the guys at that table is going to come over and bait you," she said. "He's going to insult me, hoping to make you mad. When you get up, they'll all jump you. What should I do?" "Just let it happen," I asked, incredulous. "Play along," she instructed. "If he insults me, agree with him. Don't let him rile you. Bobby V. And the boys are already getting into position. Why is this even happening? What did I do to these guys?" Carla gestured toward the table again. "See the woman with short platinum hair?" I looked closer. My stomach dropped. Holy crap! It's Marcy. What the hell is she doing here? Her boyfriend is somehow related to the bride. "I guess she's still mad at you and wants payback," Carla explained. About 10 minutes later, one of the men from Marcy's table stood up and started heading toward us. I excused myself and walked casually to the side exit, where people were smoking. The guy gestured for his 2 buddies to follow, but they didn't notice 3 men with baseball bats trailing them. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. I never raised a hand. The father of the bride thanked me for handling it outside and returned to the party. Carla eventually reappeared, looking tired but satisfied. "What happened?" I asked. "Gina and I had to take your ex-wife to the hospital. She wasn't feeling well," Carla said with a wicked grin. "Rick," and I burst out laughing. That was the last time we ever saw Marcy. Carla and I are still together, living a quiet life in our old neighborhood. Life is good.